Years bled into decades. Luiz lived in a house cluttered with half-built chairs. One night, he sat in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his own abandoned projects. He stared at a wooden table missing a leg, questioning why every path ended in silence. The dust on his tools told the truth. He had spent his life fleeing when things grew difficult. Talent meant nothing without the grit to endure the middle of the process. He stood up and gripped a chisel. Every start now demands an end, he vowed. The next morning, he picked up a neglected oak frame. When the wood split, he did not throw it away. He measured, glued, and clamped it until the seam vanished. When exhaustion pulled at his shoulders, he stayed at the bench until the sun rose. Months passed, and his workshop, once a graveyard, transformed into a gallery of finished work. Before the crowd, Luiz unveiled his masterpiece. He finally understood the secret. Greatness is simply the act of finishing what you begin. Luiz stared at the oak plank, his breath steady as he gripped the chisel. He aimed for a perfect curve, but the blade slipped. A jagged gouge scarred the wood. He dropped the tool, his palms red and his back throbbing with a persistent ache. Looking at the pile of discarded scraps, every piece was a failure. "This is too much," he muttered. Days turned into weeks. As the scent of cedar faded, Luiz sought a shortcut to success. He bought a guitar, then painting supplies, then gardening tools. Each began with a burst of energy. But the moment a guitar string snapped, or a single leaf turned yellow, the fire died. He left the trowel in the dirt and the guitar in its case, moving on before he could truly fail again. The dust settled again, a quiet reminder of his retreat from the friction of effort. His room became a graveyard of unfinished projects. Each object was a monument to a dream abandoned. He stood amongst the clutter, realizing that by avoiding the friction of the work, he had only succeeded in surrounding himself with the ghosts of who he could have been. Luiz stood in his workshop, surrounded by stacks of raw oak and gleaming chisels. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the saw. Every cent of his savings was tied to this gear. He believed a world-class empire began with this single, silent block of wood. He pressed the blade against the grain, pushing with a rhythmic, steady motion. Wood shavings curled onto the floor like golden ribbons. By noon, the first joint was cut. It fit perfectly. Luiz wiped sweat from his brow with a stained rag, his heart racing with the thrill of precision. He ignored the clock, every stroke of the chisel a step toward greatness. He imagined his name etched into mahogany in galleries across the globe. He swung the mallet, driving steel deep into timber to carve complex patterns. The wood groaned under the pressure, but Luiz did not falter. As the sun dipped below the horizon, long shadows stretched across his unfinished masterpiece. He stood back, chest heaving, staring at the rough shape of his ambition. Nothing could stop his ascent now. Luiz stared at the unfinished wooden chair in his workshop, his hands coated in fine sawdust. 6 months ago, he would have walked out at the first sign of a splinter. But today, the biting morning air couldn't drive him back to bed. He chose to stay. He tightened his grip on the steel tool, carving a precise, steady line into the stubborn oak. Every movement was deliberate. He was no longer fighting the wood. He was learning its language, one shavings at a time, focused entirely on the task at hand. Suddenly, the grain split. A jagged crack moved across the surface like a bolt of lightning. Luiz paused. The old anger flared, but he didn't throw the chisel. He didn't curse. He simply walked to the water bucket, splashed his face, and returned. He measured the gap and began to sand. He worked until the flaw vanished into the smooth timber. His neighbor watched in disbelief, but Luiz only saw the curve of the wood. As the sun set, the oil transformed the dull wood into glowing mahogany. Luiz ran his hand over the finish. He hadn't just built a chair. He had forged a new version of himself. There were no shortcuts, only the steady rhythm of persistence. Years of relentless practice transformed Luiz. His hands moved with rhythmic precision, Every joint fit perfectly, and every surface glowed with a unique, polished sheen. Word of his mastery traveled far beyond the small village, drawing travelers from distant cities. One afternoon, a wealthy businessman stepped inside, his expensive coat brushing against sawdust. He turned to Luiz with a firm handshake. "Your work is peerless. This contract will make you famous." Luiz accepted, his hands steady as he signed the papers. He scaled his operation, building a sprawling workshop filled with new tools and a dedicated team of apprentices. He stood at the center of his success, teaching his students how to sand wood until it felt like silk. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the sound of progress. Quality never wavered. Despite his wealth, Luiz kept his old workbench in the corner. He arrived early each morning, his apron stained with dust. His true legacy was the unwavering discipline that turned a simple woodworker into a master. Luiz sat in his quiet study, surrounded by the polished trophies of a successful life. Yet, his eyes always returned to a single, rusted hammer. It was a relic from a time of broken promises. Back then, he was a man of 1,000 beginnings, but 0 endings. At the community center, he saw his younger self in a frustrated boy. "It is too hard," the boy sighed, pushing his sketchbook away. "I am done." Luiz stepped forward, the heavy clatter of his old hammer hitting the table. "I once chose the easy path of walking away," Luiz said, his voice steady, "but excitement is only a spark. Perseverance is the fuel that keeps the fire burning. Difficulty is the gatekeeper of success, not a sign to stop. You do not wish it away. You work through it, one stroke at a time. Pick up the pencil. Finish the line. That is how you build a life." As the pencil touched paper, a cycle of failure finally broke. Luiz stood before the heavy oak doors of his new academy. He did not build this place for fame, but to pass on a steady spirit. Inside, students watched as Luiz picked up a chisel. He did not speak of theories. Instead, he showed them the jagged scar on his thumb from his first failed project. Every morning, he stood on the workshop floor, repeating his mantra. He forced them to restart if work lacked precision, teaching that discipline is a habit. Years passed. Gray-haired and leaning on a cane, Luiz watched his former students. On his final night, he sat at his workbench. He picked up one last piece of wood, sanding the edges until they were perfectly smooth, and placed it firmly into its frame. He exhaled slowly, hands resting on the finished work. He closed his eyes as the workshop fell silent. His life's work was complete. Remember, starting